On whether or not Canada faces an existential crisis of competitiveness.
Bill Robson at the podium, welcoming you to the Regent Debate on whether or not Canada faces an existential crisis of competitiveness. David Powell, welcome. Please come in. We're very much looking forward to this, and you can see at a glance what a terrific group has come to engage on this question, which I think is a tribute both to the salience of the topic and the quality of our debaters. I have been asked by my colleagues to say a few things about the C.D. Howe Institute, and I trust you won't mind if, for those of you who don't know the Institute, I say that we are an economic policy think tank. We do work in a number of areas, all the way from government budgets, international trade, healthcare, education, transparency in government. I say that because Bonnie Lysyck's in the crowd. Many of the most important topics that we look at, try to elucidate with the analysis, foster good discussion about, are under this heading of competitiveness. And so it's terrific to be able to address all these issues. I think probably a few of you have thought of the possibility that the outcome of the US midterms might determine how existential this is. Whether we face an existential crisis of competitiveness or simply a garden variety, run-of-the-mill, everyday crisis like we all have to deal with on a regular basis, or indeed, and this is the last thing I'll say before formally making the introductions, I lead a bit of a dual life in my professional role, because when we're talking to the domestic audience, it's about the terrible future that awaits us and our children if we do not change all our evil ways. So I could take that side. Then in front of an international audience that's looking at Canada, what do you say to them? Heck of a place to be. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So you could take that side of it as well. That's enough for now. If you want to hear more about the C.D. Howe Institute, former President Maureen Farrow is in the room. We have several board members, Victor Dodig, Stephen Smith, Cyrus Madden. Did I miss anyone? So you can ask them. But the board member that I particularly want to introduce you to now is Aaron Regent, who with his wife Heather is sponsoring this debate series. Aaron will be very well known to you already for his work in mining particularly. He's a board member of the Bank of Nova Scotia. I know he has a number of colleagues here tonight, as well as Nutrien. He's a board member of the C.D. Howe Institute, and it's thanks to his generosity and vision that we're here to enjoy this debate. So Aaron, thank you very much. Please take the podium to introduce the subject. Sure.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, ministers Oliver, Duncan, Ecker, and Duguid, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight for what will be an important and I'm sure interesting conversation, It'd be difficult, I think, to find an issue of greater import than Canada's competitiveness. We are a small, open economy, sitting next to the world's largest, most dynamic one, in a context where the United States has turned inwards, has begun closing its borders, and is actively and explicitly encouraging the repatriation of investment capital. Concerns that Canada will be left behind cannot be exaggerated enough. We are a jurisdiction characterized by high taxes, significant regulation, and an uncertain productivity and innovation record. On the other hand, in a world of rising nationalism, Canada has remained open and remains a beacon for the world's talent pool of highly skilled professionals. We have amazing human capital, world-class universities and hospitals, a strong social safety net, modern and safe cities, and governments threatening to at last invest in productive infrastructure. How we respond to the question of our competitiveness will have long-lasting implications that could fundamentally alter, for better or worse, our quality of life and standard of living for generations to come. Perhaps this is why we have representatives from across the political spectrum participating tonight. This topic is just too important to ignore. But I know it is more important, but I know it is more than that. I think it is a credit to our participants, and I believe our country's political culture that we are able to host a cross-partisan event like this. We are prepared to work together and to listen to each other. Our jury is comprised of representatives from each major political party, together with business leaders and academics. And our debaters tonight cut across the political divide, with each side boasting ministers from both the Conservative and Liberal parties. Now, it's not lost on any of us that another debate is coming to a close with the U.S. congressional midterms being held this evening. Given the climate in the United States today, it is easy to believe that the proliferation of a toxic and polarized politics is unstoppable, inevitable, and could possibly take hold here. But tonight's discussion demonstrates it is not inevitable. But nonpartisanship and civility in our public discourse is not a given either. It must be sustained, it must be nurtured, and it must be encouraged. And this is why Heather and I are such strong supporters of the C.D. Howe Institute, a national treasure in terms of raising the level of public debate. And we are proud to contribute to it in our own small way with the support for this series. It is our hope that as a forum for good faith policy discussions, these debates will contribute to a stronger national civic discourse, which is so important to us all. It is in this spirit I want to thank all of our esteemed guests for taking part in this discussion. Ministers Oliver, Duncan, Duguid, and Ecker, we are so honored by your presence and proud of the example you set here tonight by reaching across party lines to advance the interests of the country and help us stir intelligent and civil debate. Now, before I wrap up, I can't help notice, but Nathan Rotman is here as well. Nathan is the Chief of Staff to the NDP Premier of Alberta, and I should also mention is on our jury tonight. And Nathan, I promise that we will work to host an NDP member on the panel in the future, but for tonight you can simply enjoy the evening and sit back and judge and critique both the Tories and the Liberals at the same time. In closing, I'd also like to thank Bill Robson and Duncan Munn and the entire team at the C.D. Howe for the work you do. It is so important for Canada to have organizations like the C.D. Howe. And I'd like to single out Duncan, who has done an amazing job in pulling this event together and has been a real pleasure to work with. And to Devin and Paulina, I'm not sure where they are, but they're here and always are making this night run smoothly. So thank you to the National Club for hosting us, and to all of you for being here tonight and demonstrating your interest in public policy, which reflects our shared passion and care for this great country.
Well, Aaron, thank you very much for your remarks and, of course, for your support, without which we would not host this event, and we do look forward to it very much. I cannot see the body language of my colleagues, so they'll have to make alarmed noises if I get off the script, but I invite them to do so. It might warm us up for some of the audience reaction to what's about to be said from the front of the room. But what I think would be a good idea now, please, would be for me to ask our debaters to come forward. You have in the material in front of you their biographies, which are remarkable stories of accomplishment, notably their contributions in public life. And so on the affirmative side, we have Dwight Duncan, who, among many other things, is Ontario's former Liberal Minister of Finance. He's currently a bridge builder. Dwight, thank you very much for coming. And also on the affirmative, we have Joe Oliver, former federal Conservative Minister of Finance, and very well known to those of you, particularly in the investment industry, for his long and distinguished career, both in the business and also in the industry, the professional side. Joe, thank you very much. Brad Duguid, who is a former Liberal Minister of Economic Development and Growth, much else in Ontario, and currently has a very lively interest, as it says in the biographical materials, in some sports that can do you a bit of damage, but also in diets that can repair that damage. So he's
Okay.
all-round health guy. So Brad, thank you very much. And Janet Ecker, former Progressive Conservative Minister of Finance in Ontario, Minister of another of other portfolios as well, and a senior fellow at the Howe Institute, very prominent figure in public life, especially most recently through the Toronto Financial Services Alliance. Now, as we get ready, the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to have our initial vote. Our jurors, who I will introduce formally in a moment because it'll take a while to tabulate the results, under the able chairing of Tiff Macklem, we have Marcel Boyer, Heather Chalmers, Peter MacKay, Greg Aranchak, Nathan Rotman, aforementioned, Claire Kennedy, and Aaron Regent are going to be giving their opinions, and then each of you should have a clicker on the table in front of you, and we are going to use this technology, which will presumably work better than the US midterm election technology, to get an initial view from the jury and from the audience. So if you have a clicker in front of you, you press a button and the clicker will record your response. If you change your mind, it'll record the last thing that you picked. And once we have that initial reaction, we will proceed to the debate, and there will be another vote after the debate. I am now looking over at our technologists. The compilation is going on, so let me, while that's coming up, just say a little bit more about our jury. Tiff Macklem, former Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. We have Marcel Boyer, Professor Emeritus of Industrial Economics and Fellow at Cyrano at the Université de Montréal, a Fellow of the Howe Institute. Heather Chalmers, President and CEO of GE Canada, and a very likely prospect to join the Howe Institute's Board of Directors. Peter MacKay, former federal cabinet minister, partner at Baker and McKenzie. Greg Aranchak, Deputy Minister, Ontario Minister of Finance. Nathan Rotman, as aforementioned, Chief of Staff to the Premier of Alberta and a repeat juror at this debate. So there you have some real testimony to the power of it to draw again. Claire Kennedy, Managing Partner, Clients and Industries at Bennett Jones, also on the board of the Bank of Canada, and Chair of the Governing Council at the University of Toronto, as if she wasn't busy enough. And of course, Aaron Regent, who you just heard from. How are we doing with the vote tally?
What's this thing?
We don't think there's any interference by any foreign powers.
If it's a light, it would be great to turn it on. What's this? Is this a light?
Yes.
How do you turn it on? Because it would be great if you could.
Yeah,
Let me check about that.
I've never met him actually. Met her, certainly. Yeah.
No, I don't
Yeah.
think it is a light. I can't tell what it is.
Somebody said there's a couple of presidents next year as well. Oh yeah, Brian Porter. Yeah, he's sitting right over there. And Victor's actually on there.
I don't know whether it is a light, to tell you the truth. Anyway,
Well, they all change. Oh yeah, I mean, yeah.
Maybe not.
oh well.
I thought you were just really.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have the results. I'll be the last to know because it's on the screen behind me. I look forward to your reactions. Can we have the tally, please? A little bit of an uphill side for the negative. A lot may hinge on exactly what existential means in this context, and we look forward very much to how the affirmative side will tackle that. Let me now step aside. I will just prefigure the format here very quickly. We will have 5-minute opening statements. They are timed on these screens. First in the affirmative from Joe Oliver, then on the negative side from Janet Ecker, then on the affirmative side from Dwight Duncan, on the negative side from Brad Duguid, followed by 2-minute rebuttals in the same order. Joe Oliver, then Janet Ecker, then Dwight Duncan, then Brad Duguid. We look forward to it very much. Thank you one more time, debaters, for being willing to do this. Joe Oliver, you're up.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to talk about a gloomy subject that most people find terminally boring. But at the CD Howe, it's considered endlessly fascinating. This audience cares about public policy issues that impact significantly on people's lives, even though they may be largely unaware. Canada's deteriorating competitiveness is high on the list. An existential crisis relates to an intense danger to the existence of Canada as a prosperous country that can afford to provide essential social services, including universal health care and the other functions of a sovereign state, and to do so at a level we have come to expect. It does not have to rise to the elimination of the entire country. The facts are as compelling as they are alarming. The World Economic Forum's Competitiveness Index ranked Canada 12th overall. The US is first, and we follow several smaller countries like New Zealand, which demonstrates that lack of size need not be an impediment. According to the IMD Center and the World Bank, we rank 10th and 18th, respectively. The WEF puts us at a dismal 34th in information, communication, and technology, ICT adoption, 23rd in R&D, and a scary 96th in complexity of tariffs. Since we rank 53rd in regulatory burden, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce identified as a major problem the cumulative burden of complex, costly, and overlapping rules over time and across jurisdictions. There are important public policy objectives for the rules, but what cannot be justified are constant delays, unmanageable risks, duplication or triplication, opaqueness, polarization, use of the courts to scupper previously approved projects, moving judicial goalposts, and the unattainable requirement of unanimity, euphemistically referred to as a social license. Since 76% of our trade is with the US, representing a fifth of our economy, how Canada compares to its neighbor is crucial. Unfortunately, we are at a distinct disadvantage in tax rates, resource development, labor productivity, regulatory burden, internal trade barriers, access to capital, size of market, incentives to invest, and encouragement of entrepreneurship. Some of these disadvantages are unavoidable, but most result from dysfunctional policies. According to the Boston Consulting Group, our economic growth has come more from working harder than working smarter. Between 2000 and 2016, U.S. multi-factor productivity, which includes innovation, technological change, and productivity improvement, grew by 14% compared to only 6% in Canada. Machinery and equipment and intellectual property averaged 8% of GDP for Canada compared to 12% for the US. As a result, Canadian workers generate a quarter less GDP than their American counterparts. When Canada had a tax advantage, we generated superior growth to the other G7 countries for 8 years running. But that advantage has disappeared when the Americans enacted the most significant transformation of its tax system in over 30 years by reducing corporate taxes from 35% to 21% and fully expensing capital expenditures for the next 5 years. The positive implications for capital-intensive sectors, entrepreneurs, and SMEs is obvious. Furthermore, the U.S. reduced marginal rates in personal income brackets in contrast to our punishing taxes that discourage foreign skilled workers from immigrating and incentivize mobile, skilled Canadian workers to move to less confiscatory jurisdictions. We also have an auto trade deficit of $25 billion and a current account deficit of $60 billion, or 3% of GDP. Last year, Canada bled capital at a net outflow of more than $70 billion in direct foreign investment, a lot of it from the resource sector, but a lot in manufacturing as well. Bottom line, deteriorating productivity has created an existential crisis for Canada as we know it, and it is urgent we do something about it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Very forcefully stated. We now go to Janet.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and to the CD Howe for dragooning all of us into this tonight. This is, for those of you who missed it, this isn't the Steve Bannon, David Frum debate, and you know that because there was no crowd harassing you on your way in tonight. I'd like to start with a question. What do the following companies have in common? Arnie Fender Katsalidis, a business services company from the UK, Bamboro, a financial services company from Sweden, Booking.com, a business services company from the US, Nude by Nature, a life sciences company from Australia, Spotsy, a tech firm from the Netherlands, SATA, a manufacturing company from Germany, Cognixion, a tech company from the US, TradeGecko, a tech company from Singapore. All have made and are making significant investments, actual boots-on-the-ground investments in the Toronto region during the past year. And why? Because of our competitive value proposition as an investment destination. Now, I know our esteemed colleagues will no doubt recite reams of statistics that say that we are indeed having an existential crisis in this regard. And I know former finance ministers can be very good at that kind of thing. But for me, what matters is what's happening on the ground. What are real-world business leaders deciding when they look for a good place to invest? And from my previous vantage point as the head of the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, and now as vice chair at Toronto Global, the new multi-government regional investment attraction agency, I say with confidence that those business leaders are deciding this is the place. Let's take another snapshot. How about artificial intelligence? Definitely the economy of the future, and an area where Canada's global profile is growing rapidly. In the past year alone, DeepMind, Accenture, Facebook, Thales, Thomson Reuters, Samsung, Uber, Microsoft, Intel, and General Motors have all launched new research, boots-on-the-ground investments in this region. They have all looked around the world and concluded that here is where they want to be, right here, right now, to quote a book. Companies that have the world to choose from chose here because we have the quality and the availability of the talent that they're looking for, because we have one of the more competitive business location destinations, because we have one of the best qualities of life. And in this day and age of Trump and Brexit and God knows what next, we have one of the most stable investment locations around. They aren't reading the productivity reports or tracking the FDI flows. They are looking for what they need to succeed and finding it here. Our biggest challenge, it's not about the competitiveness, it's getting that message out to companies. And when we call and tell them, they say, let's talk. That's not a competitive problem, that's a marketing problem. So do we have competitive issues? Of course we do. But do we have an existential problem? No, we don't. So let's stop wringing our hands and make sure that our governments keep doing what they need to do to protect and enhance our competitive position, to keep investing in that precious talent, to keep working to ensure the tax structure is competitive, to keep investing in infrastructure, and yes, I agree, we need to throw in a few pipelines. Keep working to remove the red tape burden. That is a job that never ends. Keep up aggressive marketing, and yes, remember to balance the budget once in a while. And if we do that, we can continue to do well. Thank you very much.
Again, very persuasive. I'm feeling quite open-minded at this point. So looking forward, Dwight, very much to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that kind introduction. Members of the jury, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by thanking the C.D. Howe Institute for organizing and hosting this debate. I'd also like to thank Heather and Aaron Regent for their sponsoring it and for their generous philanthropic activities everywhere. Canada is unequivocally facing an existential crisis in competitiveness. Frankly, when presented with the question, Bill, I asked myself, what does that mean? Existential crisis is normally a term I associate with philosophy or human psychology. With a little help from Merriam-Webster and David Dodge, I came to understand it. I came to understand that it means that there is compelling evidence that Canada is at a decisive moment and must address the challenges associated with global competitiveness. The World Economic Forum has identified 12 pillars of competitiveness, the sets of institutions, policies, and factors that determine a country's level of productivity and, most importantly and ultimately, the well-being of all of our citizens. Since 1979, the Forum has analyzed and reported on the competitiveness of close to 98% of the world's countries. In its most recent report, Canada placed 12th overall. Since 2008, Canada has essentially moved in a narrow range around that number, breaking the top 10 only once. Any index of this nature has flaws. This one has evolved and been refined over time and considers an array of factors, including income distribution, technological change, and carbon intensity. There are a variety of other global indices and surveys where Canada scores consistently in the top 10. These include the UN's Development Index and the UN's World Happiness Report. And therein lies part of the challenge that Joe and I have in arguing the affirmative. Canadians are largely a happy people, and most of the world perceives us that way. Some Canadians would say 12th out of 137 isn't all that bad. Janet and Brad will try to convince you that we have problems, but they are manageable, and we will do well on some of the measures. Janet's already done that for me. Thank you, Janet. Nevertheless, this debate is about competitiveness, and 12th is not a podium score, not even close. The overall score masks a series of deeply troubling issues that lay bare the crisis that has existed for some time. Joe did a good job of exploring the most troubling issues and augmented the World Economic Forum's findings with those of equally credible independent authorities. Across the 12 pillars, Canada leads in only 2, and among the others, we fall well below where a country of our size, human and natural abundance should be. Referring to Canada's global competitiveness, Governor Dodge has said, there are 2 issues here. 1, we in Canada have been doing a number of things to shoot ourselves in the foot. Number 2, the world outside is changing and creating a number of uncertainties for investment in Canada, both public and privately. Both the public and private sectors have precipitated the crisis. The problem has persisted for many years, including governments of every political stripe. This is why Joe and I, whose political views are very different, can agree publicly that there is a crisis. While we will not always agree on the potential solutions, this debate is not about that. It is about whether there is a problem, which speaks volumes in and of itself about what lies ahead for our country. Let me wrap up my opening statement making 4 assertions as to why we have an existential crisis. First, the rate of change in technological development is accelerating and disrupting many aspects of our lives, businesses, and institutions. Second, our competitors are not sitting still. Joe mentioned U.S. corporate and personal taxes as an example of that. Still more interesting is how quickly some less developed economies are catching up across a range of the pillars. Third, Canada's political constitutional framework makes many of the changes we need challenging. It takes time, energy, and political capital to bring them about. Finally, and most important, is about the quality of life of Canadians. If we do not take this crisis seriously, we will fall further behind those who are ahead of us and risk losing to those lagging. All this means is a reduced standard of living for our children and grandchildren. The crisis is real. As a society, as a people, we must address it.
I think we might have been feeling better. Now we're quite anxious again. Brad, can you help? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me start off by saying I admire and respect all of my colleagues here on the podium with us here tonight. And I got to tell you, I knew Dwight and Joe back in the day when they were positive, optimistic finance ministers. Gentlemen, what happened? I just retired from politics, and I'm getting a little worried here. If Janet wasn't here, I would think the sun will never rise in the morning in the future. So, but it is great to see you all. And as Janet said, we know there are some very serious challenges out there, and we must address them. We must overcome them to be at our competitive best. But to say that Canada is in an existential crisis in competitiveness today, given the amount of investment coming into this country, the low levels of unemployment, our international competitive rankings, is really, to be frank, that's beyond negative. It's really just wrong. For the sake of our future competitiveness, I certainly hope the business leaders here in this room have a much more positive and optimistic view of our place and our potential in the new global economy. Regardless of how this debate goes tonight, the business leaders in this room and around the world are voting on Canada's competitiveness every single day with their investments. Don't take my word for it. I'm just a former politician. Just look at the facts. It's pretty hard to say that we're in a competitiveness crisis when our unemployment rate just hit a 40% low. It's pretty hard to say that we're in a competitiveness crisis when the Global Competitiveness Report that our colleagues referred to ranks Canada 12 out of 140 nations in competitiveness. Not where we want to be, but certainly it's not a crisis situation. The best judge, in my view, of whether your economy is competitive or not is not what politicians say, but what investors do. It's pretty hard to say that Canada's in a competitiveness crisis when the Kearney Foreign Direct Investment Confidence Index ranks Canada number 2 in the world in attracting foreign direct investment. It's pretty hard to say that Canada's in a competitive crisis when Canada attracted the most FDI flows per capita in the entire G7 from 2008 to 2017. But my optimism doesn't end there. Our world is changing fast. Every sector of our economy is in a full-fledged state of technological change and disruption. Just because we're competing reasonably well today is no guarantee that we'll be competing well tomorrow. But there is reason for optimism when it comes to our potential to compete in that new economy. Canada is producing some of the most sought-after talent anywhere in the world today. We rank number 1 in the OECD when it comes to post-secondary attainment, and just as importantly, number 1 in the world for women attaining post-secondary education. The Global Innovation Index ranks Canada 18th out of 128 countries in innovation. Not a podium position, to be sure, but not a crisis situation. We can and must do better, though. It's no fluke that Ontario stands as one of the final contenders for the much-publicized Amazon investment. Venture capital investment, once dried up completely in this region, is now at record levels today. Canada is recognized as having global leading strengths in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, blockchain technology, quantum technology, clean tech, and many more areas, all critical areas of great potential in the new economy. All that being said, the arguments put forward by our colleagues today are not to be discounted. Many of the concerns they raise are valid and must be addressed if we're to be at our best. But despite those challenges, the facts are undeniable. We are competing in today's economy, and we're doing reasonably well. Most, if not all, indicators demonstrate that. And the other key is that we also have great potential to excel and own the new economy. So let us not get wallowed down in negativity and instead work together, government leaders, business leaders, labor leaders, to become even more competitive and confidently prepare ourselves to lead in the new economy. Thank you.
Very good. I don't think I'm the only person for whom that tipped the scale, so thanks very much, Brad. We now go to the 2-minute rebuttals in the preceding order. Joe, you're first. Thank you.
Thanks. My honourable opponents would like us to believe that Canada has a lot of strength and is doing quite well, and they dragged out a number of anecdotal good stories and a few isolated stats. Apparently, marketing is part of the problem. There is no doubt we have strengths, especially a stable political climate, rule of law, civil peace, and an educated population. And that is why Canada is a prosperous country. But our poor competitiveness is dragging us down. It is imperiling our future prosperity, leaving too many Canadians behind and undermining our ability to provide the services that Canadians have come to expect. Here are some other stats. In pupil-to-teacher ratio in primary schools, we rank 56. In distortive effect of taxes and subsidies on competition, 44. In ease of hiring foreign labor, 81. In internal labor mobility, 29. In labor tax rate, 50. In attitude to entrepreneurship risk, 31. In companies embracing disruptive ideas, 28. We need to do better or we will continue to fall behind. Resting on our laurels and virtue signaling our progressive superiority should leave us wondering why Australia, with 2/3 of our population, has become the envy of the world, according to The Economist. While the cognoscenti obsess about the horrors of the Trump presidency, the U.S. is eating our lunch. We need to make bold moves to reduce taxes, transport resources to overseas markets, and eliminate internal trade barriers, amongst other important things. Thank you.
Thank you. Without a break, Janet.
Thank you very, very much. Our esteemed colleagues on that side of the platform mentioned that former governor of the bank, David Dodge, mentioned that the world is changing. And he's absolutely right. The economy of the future. And that's what we're building here in this country and certainly here in this province. We have over 49 business accelerators and incubators. That's more than New York City, that's more than London, that's more than Berlin, that's more than Tel Aviv, where the companies of the future are being grown. Waterloo has the largest co-op program in the world. U of T is now in the top 20 in the world as a university. Vector is starting to lead the world in artificial intelligence. Mars is one of the world's largest urban innovation hubs. DMZ is a top university business incubator in North America. Velocity is the world's largest free startup incubator. The Perimeter Institute is the largest in the world of its kind, and Waterloo's Quantum Institute, again, one of the largest in the world in its kind. These are all part of building the economy for the future. The quality of our talent has been mentioned, and I can't tell you how many times potential investors say that's why we're here. The quality and the availability of that talent. We actually have rankings in the latest PISA scores where we actually did very well. And I think that's important. We're top 5 in PISA math. Ontario has, we've been mentioned the statistics for how many post-secondary degrees that we have here. Canada tops the OECD. Ontario's even better than that at 67%. 3 provinces, top 5 in PISA math, as I mentioned. So we do have what the economy of the future needs, and that is talent, and we need to keep pushing that, and we will be much, much better as we go forward.
Mustn't applaud too enthusiastically. I might look partial. Dwight, over to you.
Well, I'd like to first of all respond by saying that Joe and I are patriots, and I'm a proud Canadian. And there's a lot to cheer about in this country. Janet mentioned our financial services sector, and if you look at the global numbers, we are in fact number two. Number two in the operation of them, number one, or number three in the regulation of them. So, and Janet, there have been lots of investments. There have been lots of investments in many other places as well. And any of us who come from other parts of the country can point to factories that left a long, long time ago, in part because of competitiveness. And yes, it is important to sing our praises. It's like being a Leafs fan. There have been a lot of good things over the last 30 years. They just haven't won the Stanley Cup. And at the end of the day, you want to win the Stanley Cup. And, right? I mean, good goaltending once in a while, they just can't put it all together. I'd much rather win the cup than win individual points. So as thought leaders, as business leaders, as elected leaders, former elected leaders, our challenge, frankly, is to sing our praises, absolutely, but not turn a blind eye to what has been identified, not just this year, but repeatedly since before the Great Recession, that we have things to do better, and if we put our collective minds to it, we will do that.
Thank you, Dwight. Brad, final rebuttal goes to you.
Well, I want to begin my conversation here with a quote from a great Canadian leader, and no, Peter MacKay, I wasn't referring to you. Could have been you, but it wasn't. And the quote goes as follows: "The Canadian economy is in pretty good shape, despite the fall in oil prices. We shouldn't be unduly pessimistic. Canada is doing well. We've created 1.2 million jobs. We're better than most other countries, and Canadians should be reassured by that." Those comments, I would suggest that we're hardly in a competitiveness crisis, and they were made just a short 36 months ago by none other than the Honourable Joe Oliver. So, Joe, I want to tell you, Janet, I agree with you on that. And since then, it takes a while to lose the political piece of being a politician, but and since then, Canada's economic prospects have, if anything, improved. You know, Canada's up 600,000 net new jobs in the last 24 months alone. Janet and I have already shared with you a number of credible statistics, international reports, and other things that support our case. But frankly, the true judge of competitiveness is not theoretical discussions among former politicians, but what companies are actually doing. You simply can't dismiss the impressive list of real investments Janet shared with you earlier on. So let me add to Janet's list. $5.6 billion over the last 3 years alone have been invested in Canada's auto sector. $500 million recently invested by Sanofi Pasteur in their pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. A record $2 billion invested by Nova in our revitalized Sarnia chemistry industry. If we were in a crisis in competitiveness, there's no way we would have landed those investments. Janet and I agree that we have some serious challenges to overcome. No question about that. But we're confident we'll be able to get the job done.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was a tremendous airing of the issues. I also, as moderator, am compelled to say that every one of our speakers was exactly to time, so I'm very grateful that they managed to get so much factual evidence and such illuminating interpretations in front of us in that time. We are now going to take a short break. Please don't go anywhere unless it's a bit of an emergency. Our debaters need to catch their breath. We are going to reconvene in a few minutes with some questions from the jury posed by Foreman Tiff Macklem. So please relax just for a moment. Our debaters can confer with each other. We'll get Tiff the microphone to you, and we look forward to hearing the questions which the teams will take turns answering. Whether we have an existential crisis of competitiveness or not, we are going to run to time. There will be no existential crisis on that front. So, our jury foreman, Tiff Macklem, is now armed with his microphone and his questions. Thank you, jury members, for your input on these. So what we will now do is Tiff will pose the question. The affirmative team will have 2 minutes to tackle it first, and then we will go to the negative team for the first question. Tiff has 4 questions. The teams will alternate with their answers, and they can decide between themselves how they would like to handle each one. Tiff, thank you, and we look forward to hearing the questions.
Well, it's been a wonderful debate. It's a real shame that I'm going to have to lose 2 friends tonight, but our job as a jury is to push you a little bit. So, first question. Concerns about competitiveness often focus on the costs of taxation and regulation, as we've just heard, which tend to be higher in Canada than in the US. But what about the benefits of public services like healthcare and education, and the benefits of regulations that protect consumers and improve the environment? If what people really care about is health, education, and security, aren't these policies making us more competitive and not less?
Thank you. Thank you. Dwight, are you taking this one? Thank you.
First of all, you do have to find the right balance between taxation levels and services offered. There's no question, but you also have to have the right taxes. For instance, our government harmonized the sales tax, provincial sales tax, which was much more efficient than the previous regime. Today, governments are collecting certain taxes that it costs them more to collect than they get from the tax. That's the next evolution. Plus, as Joe says, and he's very passionate about it, we can't ignore what's gone on in the United States. So when we cut, by the way, Ontario now has the lowest corporate taxes in Canada, for those of you who thought I was a tax and spend liberal. We have the lowest taxes in Canada for corporations now, number 1. And we did have an advantage over Michigan and other places for a very long time. That has vanished. I'm not sure that it's just tax rates alone. For instance, if you look at the international competitiveness, a number of countries that are leading us in competitiveness actually have higher tax rates, but they have a better tax system in terms of how they tax, particularly corporations. Joe?
The quality, I think we can all agree that the quality of healthcare, education, sound regulation do add to competitiveness. You know, we rank second in soundness of banks, although we used to be first. We're number 1 in diversity. We're tied for 1 in macroeconomic stability. But we would have a much deeper problem without those strengths. It isn't, however, sufficient justification for uncompetitive taxes or deficits without an end, which saddle our children with a debt burden and ultimately bring down growth as more and more resources have to be devoted to interest payments. The fact that we're doing well in some sectors is not a justification or a solution to the profound problem we're confronting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, absolutely, I think credit goes to Dwight for being willing to touch one of the 3rd rails of politics, the HST, and harmonize it. I think that was a great thing to do for the Ontario economy and took a lot of guts to actually do that. The question around taxes, that is not the first thing that companies are looking at. We talked about before about it was the talent, was the number 1 thing. Taxes certainly are part of the value proposition. You have to have a competitive tax framework. There's no question about that. And it has to be competitive with the key competing jurisdictions. But this isn't about a race to the bottom. And those jurisdictions that try to do that don't win the competitive race either, certainly not for the long term. So is your tax framework competitive with your key competing jurisdictions is an important point to make. And I think, yes, there needs to be changes here and there on certain things, but we do have a competitive taxation situation. And it's interesting that Canada's budgetary officer said that this year's business data is not backing up the complaints that some of the business community have been making about our tax competitiveness. But the other thing is, have you got the right balance in terms of the services that people also want here? So for example, Nicole Verkind, the founder of Omics, was saying it was amazing how cost effective it was to have her staff in Canada as opposed to the US because healthcare was covered. That healthcare system is an amazing advantage for our companies here. And again, Amazon, in the discussions in the bid book that we did on that, that was a major, major win for them. And they saw that it wasn't the tax structure or the incentives they were looking for, it was things like those employee costs because of those social services and the quality of the talent. So I think that's very, very much has to be kept in mind when you're looking at, are we competitive in the tax situation?
Thank you. Well, Tiff, you stirred up some trouble with that one. What's next?
Okay, well, that's pretty good, but it's going to get harder. Outside of a few sectors like financial services, energy, telecom, Canada's largely a country of small businesses. We struggle to scale up, and we have very few truly global companies. Is that not itself evidence of a competitiveness crisis?
I'll start again. Well, first of all, let's not diss the financial services sector, which right now is the biggest private sector employer in this region. Thank you very much. Yes, we do have some challenges with an economy that is very much SME and branch plant based. But I think we're in mid-evolution. One of the exciting things that's been happening to the economy is the growth in venture cap that is focused and paying attention to what needs to be done to help those companies scale up. I mean, Stephen Smith is here with his new Peloton fund that's talking about being absolutely about long-term patient capital. We have Brian Porter and Victor Dodig here, two of our bank CEOs who help lead the Business Growth Fund. Again, a business solution to help companies grow. And we're starting to see, we've had a great record on startups, and we're starting to see that some of those startups are indeed growing and starting to reach out globally. So yes, there's a challenge, and yes, governments need to pay attention to that, but I think we can point to a lot of great progress in this particular area.
And let me just add a little bit to that, because I think that it's something that we need to totally focus on. There's no question at all. But there has been some good progress made. Governments have to change their focus today from the old days of trying to attract just multinational investments, but rather change their programs to really try to build our businesses up here, which is all about scaling. The Government of Ontario's done that. The federal government's starting to do that now, and we're among the first governments that I know of, certainly in the part of the world that I've done business with, that are doing that. That is helping. It's also helpful to have that $1 billion federal fund that's going to help growing businesses invest in themselves, invest in things like improving IT technology within their companies. And that's going to help improve our productivity as well for those companies. So I think it's a problem, but it's something that I think we're on the right track to try to resolve.
Thank you. Okay, affirmative team, that question's in your wheelhouse.
Look, at the macro level, scale is crucial in international markets, which are global, innovative, and competitive. And without scale, Canadian companies will be confined to a small regional market. If they're attractive, they'll be taken over, and if they're struggling, they'll likely wither and fail. The concern is that the lack of capital investment is hindering companies from growing and acquiring the scale that they need to survive independently or prosper to the maximum extent possible. You know, I think of a number of companies, including Canada Goose, which is a wonderfully successful apparel company. There was actually, think of this, a Canadian apparel company exporting to China. Well, it felt it needed a U.S. partner to maximize its global market potential. And there are innumerable other examples, including in the technology sector and, of course, in resources. And what we're seeing in resources is a huge number of companies now, because of regulation and taxes, packing their bags, as Ted Morton wrote today in the Financial Post, and heading down south. This is a loss which will not be recuperated from.
I'd only add to that that while my experience with government programs aimed at attracting and keeping businesses like private programs, they don't always work. I'd like to see a country where we have more private venture capitalists. We're 31st in the world today. There's been a lot of great developments, and I'm delighted to hear about what we've seen. Frankly, we're not keeping up with other jurisdictions. So I think if we're taking an honest look at this and self-assessing, governments can, number one, there are some anomalies in every tax system in each province in this country and federally that can help small business. And number two, do more to allow private venture capital to create the conditions that more private investors will want to put their money behind Canadian startups.
Okay, Tiff, what's next?
Okay, well, let's come back to talent. Something very close to my heart. Canada is attracting more foreign students than ever before, and many more people immigrate to Canada, into Canada than leave Canada. In a world where talent is the biggest asset, looks like we're competing pretty well. Is there really a competitiveness problem here?
We need to have an open immigration policy that attracts the types of immigrants that can not only reunite them with their families, but more importantly, can add to the economy and their families can benefit. We see it every day. This city, I think, is a shining example of growth and prosperity that can, in part, be attributed to an open and diverse culture that is very accepting of new Canadians. I see it in my community. We have the largest Arabic-speaking population in Canada. The community's been growing for about 20 years. Members of that community are now taking leadership roles in business, the arts, the professions, and indeed, I don't think it'll be too long before one of them gets elected to public office. Tonight, a prominent Arab American woman will become the first Arab American woman elected to the United States Congress. Frankly, as the chair of the bridge company, that's got lots of problems for me, but the point here is that we do have robust immigration. We have an open economy. We accept people, we're attracting scientists, and that's terrific. We need to keep building on that. That is one of the great things about this country, and that's one of the things that if we get other things wrong, mucks it up. And I think you've hit on something that's extraordinarily important to our future.
Well, I certainly agree with its importance, and we're very supportive of a robust immigration policy, but personal tax rates have an impact on attracting and then retaining the talented people we're able to initially attract. And then, of course, the lack of capital investment means that the companies they're working for may not be as attractive for them as they are in the United States, where they have more scope. We rank #1 in diversity of our population, but the question is, are we able to attract and retain the most highly skilled workers?
We were almost getting cheerful there. What happens over here?
Well, we've gone from a country that was extremely conservative and risk-averse as a population to one that today is producing some of the best, if not the most sought-after talent when it comes to tech and engineering anywhere in the world today. Do you know that an Ontario engineering grad and tech grad is more sought after than any other grad in North America in the Valley, other than Berkeley grads, which is something to be proud of. At the same time, what that's doing is it's providing a nice pipeline of talent to grow our own companies here in Canada. Our challenge, as I think was alluded to by those on the other side, is that we have to retain as much of that talent as possible. Look, it's a global economy. You're not going to keep them all. You don't want to keep, you want young people to have the world as their oyster. At the same time, we want to make sure that our growth companies here are able to access some of that talent so they can then grow and go from startups to scale-ups to global competitive companies. Our talent is our calling card. Our talent is what's bringing lots of big investments here. Our talent is why Reuters, Thomson Reuters located here not long ago. Our talent is why we're on the same page and in the final grouping of the Amazon bid. So that really is something that, in my view, distinguishes us from other jurisdictions. Janet?
Yeah, and I think our talent stats are very, very strong. I mean, over half the population in the Toronto region was born outside the country. Over 180 languages are spoken here. Total international student enrollment has grown 52%, and international student visas allow grads to stay and work for 3 years. Last year, we created more tech-related jobs than San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington combined. So we are competing in this very critical economy of the future, and we need to keep pushing that.
We are getting more cheerful. Tiff, are you going to fix that?
Okay, last question. We're going to have a bit of fun with this one. Competition is essential to encouraging innovation and productivity. But across many sectors, government policy deliberately stifles competition. Supply management in agriculture is a preeminent example of government limiting competition, handicapping key Canadian industries, raising prices for consumers, and cutting off exports. Yet all parties support it. Other heavily regulated sectors, banking, telecom, for example, regulatory measures also limit competition.
Sorry, Maxime Bernier's part.
How can we be said to be competitive when government policy deliberately reduces competition?
Well, let me say that you've hit a sensitive issue on supply management. You know, every one of the major parties is in favor of it, and I think we know why. There's a political dimension, but I've believed for quite some time that it could actually be a political winner because 36 million Canadians would benefit, and the poor 5 times as much, according to the Montreal Economic Institute, as wealthier Canadians because they spend a larger proportion of their income on staples. It would also provide a broader consumer choice. It would provide opportunities for exports, and it would eliminate a huge trade irritant going forward. So this is one example of uncompetitiveness that is serious and costing Canadians individually hundreds of dollars every single year. I think, you know, we have a Competition Act. We're spending more time, or the Competition Bureau is spending more time looking at issues relating to the economic impact more than they used to, and that's positive because it'll increase the chances that competition policy will achieve its core objective, which includes efficiency and adaptability and therefore competitiveness. But the question is how much is in their purview and how much in the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. And I think we have a serious problem in that regard.
I would just add, we can't even bring beer across provincial borders. And I addressed this in my opening remarks. I said that there are political and institutional challenges to any government, regardless of the political stripe. And that's why it is a crisis, because over years we can't eliminate this. Challenged in court, provinces fight with the federal government, provinces fight with other provinces. So I addressed it in my beginning, I'll address it a little bit in my conclusion, but that is a real challenge. There are things that we can fix, in my view, pretty quickly, but there are real institutional, political, constitutional impediments to governments, regardless of intention, being able to address things.
We did have one comment go over time, and it was about beer. There you go.
And I can't help but jump in and carry on with that. The good news is we now have the most ambitious domestic free trade agreement that Canada has ever had. That comes with the first jurisdiction in the world to have a mechanism that helps us harmonize and standardize regulations and standards across the country. It's not up and operating yet, but it's on its way to operating. So it's got us into a place where we can make ourselves very, very competitive if all of the political players want to. I think, though, you have to be very careful when you get into some of these areas, financial institutions, insurance, telecom, banking, when it comes to worrying about stifling competition. Yes, it'd be nice to have more affordable cell phone rates. I think there's not a person in the country that wouldn't enjoy that. It could be good politically, too. Joe's right. But you have to be careful that you don't overdo it. Because if you do, you could get into a situation where you end up in a financial meltdown like we saw in the U.S. because it wasn't regulated strongly enough. So there has to be thoughtful, it has to be balanced, it probably need not be political, but I would say that it's something that can help competitiveness, but be very, very careful when you go into these areas. Janet?
Yes, I think the word caution is very important because in financial services, it's that regulatory framework that was one of the significant factors in making sure that our banks have continued to remain safest and soundest in the world. And that's a pretty important point for our competitiveness as well. Good leadership helped too, but that regulatory framework was very much part of that. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that, we've got 13 trade agreements going now that we are part of, opening up markets to 44 countries, over 1 billion consumers. And that's going to help drive, I think, our competitiveness and our ability to succeed as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Tiff and the jury, we really appreciate your posing those questions. They elicited some more good information and touched on a few high or low notes, depending on what you think of supply management. So now we go to our closing remarks. Each debater on each team has 4 minutes, and this time we go in reverse order. So Janet will be first with her 4 minutes. We will then go to Joe, then to Brad, and then to Dwight. Janet, if you need a moment to catch your breath, you can have it. Otherwise, if you're ready, we're ready.
Thank you very, very much, Bill. And, one of the nice things, one of the big pluses for our competitiveness is that we can do a debate like this tonight, that it actually happened, and that members of different political parties could team together to have a civilized and reasonably informed debate about some of the major public policy issues of our time. And so thank you to C.D. Howe and to Aaron and Heather for making this happen. But back to our original question, do we have an existential crisis? And Brad and I do not believe that we do. And yes, our esteemed colleagues have peppered us with all kinds of doom and gloom statistics that have us going to you-know-where in a you-know-what. For the policy wonks, go ahead and have the argument. But for the rest of us, look at what is happening on the ground. For the fiscal year 2017-2018, Toronto Global, the multi-government investment attraction agency that represents Toronto and all of the regions, Durham, York, Halton, Mississauga, Brampton, attracted 27 investments resulting in almost 2,000 new jobs, over 4,000 indirect jobs, almost $200 million in capital expenditures. That was just in the first year of operation. And this year, we are on track to blow through these targets. And the secret to that growing success is the growing value proposition in this region and in this country. And it's that right mix of quality talent, of quality of life, of our cost effectiveness, of our diverse economies with their strengths in the new economies and the new industries of the future. It is all of those things. And when we can get the message out through agencies like Toronto Global, through the new federal agency, Invest Canada, that's reaching out around the world. We have an excellent track record of attracting new investment here. Brad mentioned Sanofi Pasteur with their $500 million investment in a vaccine manufacturing facility. It's not only their largest investment outside France in generations, if not ever. Or Toyota's recently announced $1.4 billion in investment to build the next generation RAV4 here in Canada. Or any of the other major investments and expansions from Websure from the UK, TIPSA from Spain, SIEAE from Jamaica, Morgan McKinley from Ireland. The list goes on. Yes, we have issues that we need to deal with going forward, and if we hope to keep this record going, improvements to our tax framework, continued investments in talent, better marketing and outreach efforts to get on the radar of potential investors. An immigration program, keeping that program that is supporting investment going well. Ongoing efforts at regulatory and red tape reduction. More money for infrastructure projects. And finally, governments that recognize that the business community of existing and potential investors is a resource to be cultivated and supported, not just harvested. All of this is needed on a continual basis, but an existential crisis it is not. The proof point is what is happening on the ground. We are winning where we need to in the economy of the future. That is the recipe for future economic prosperity. Thank you very much.
I think even the policy wonks could get behind that. Thank you. Joe, over to you.
Well, thank you. Two areas of uncompetitiveness are so significant that they merit special attention: natural resources and interprovincial trade. Canadian resources account for 17% of the economy, almost half merchandise exports, and 1.8 million jobs. The energy sector alone represents a tenth of GDP. Canada has vast oil reserves, the third largest in the world, 10% of the total, and enough natural gas to meet 200 years of domestic need. Yet this hugely important source of Canadian jobs, growth, and government revenue is being actively disadvantaged by misguided policies and damaging regulations. This year, the U.S. became the world's largest producer of oil and gas, the result of a shale revolution, while 4 eastern provinces incongruously banned fracking, which has been safely and profitably pursued for over 60 years in Western Canada. Even more importantly, Canada remains landlocked, unable to transport resources to tidewater and on to overseas markets. President Trump is aggressively cutting back on regulations so that capital growth in American oil and gas sector is up 40% this year. In contrast, Canadian resource development is down, increasingly mired in court challenges and red tape, impacting drilling, oil sands projects, and pipeline construction. The latest marauder is Bill C-69. The new Impact Assessment Act would create so much risk, delay, and expense, there is no way a private sector investor would sponsor a major new pipeline project without a government guarantee. Meanwhile, Canadian resource companies, as I said, are leaving the country for the U.S. Canada has been losing $15 to $20 billion annually because pipeline constraints caused a steep discount to international prices for oil and gas sold to the U.S. The most recent discount represents an annualized loss of almost $47 billion to the Canadian economy and $14 billion to Canadian governments. When you consider how those funds could be used for health care or to alleviate poverty, it's a national tragedy and a national disgrace. In light of the USMCA near collapse, Canada obviously needs to diversify its markets, and not only for energy, but the domestic situation is almost as bad. Interprovincial trade barriers cost our country a crushing $50 to $130 billion annually, representing an average $2,700 in lost income for each Canadian. The Supreme Court's Como decision validated provincial tariffs. Provinces can hide behind the court, or they can actually stop hurting the country by eliminating their tariffs. Canada is a prosperous country that can enhance the standard of living and social services Canadians have come to expect, but only if we address our deteriorating competitiveness. Too few people connect the dots between the vast missed opportunities and wait lines in emergency crowded classrooms, inadequate social services, and decaying infrastructure. Public understanding of the crisis could push governments to tackle it with an urgent action plan that focuses on jobs and growth. An affirmative vote would advance that objective.
Thank you. Brad, it is your turn.
Well, let me begin after a fabulous night of discussion by saying that Janet and I are not here to argue that when it comes to competitiveness, Canada's out of the woods. We agree with most, if not all, of the challenges outlined by Dwight and Joe. They ought not be dismissed, and they ought to be addressed. What we're saying here is that Canada is competing reasonably well in today's economy, and we're confident we'll continue to compete well in the new economy. The idea that we're in an existential crisis in competitiveness simply belies most economic indicators, be it job creation, unemployment rates, FDI inflow numbers, or the bulk of third-party credible international ranking data. It would be typically Canadian, however, for us to demonstrate a lack of confidence by declaring ourselves uncompetitive when the evidence suggests otherwise. So I urge you today not to do that. Let us not apologize for being successful as Canadians in today's global economy. Let us not turn away from those great opportunities Canada's world-class talent now has in front of them to lead the new economy. Given the facts that we shared with you today, you'd have to be very pessimistic and in a very pessimistic state of mind to conclude that Canada is indeed in an existential crisis in competitiveness. That's why Janet and I are frankly a little bit concerned about our opposing colleagues here today. You see, there's a condition that many former finance ministers get, and they tend to get it in retirement. It's not their fault, it's just a simple hazard of the job. But it seems obvious to Janet and I tonight that our friends Dwight and Joe are clearly suffering from something called former finance minister post-traumatic negativity disorder. That is better known as Eeyores disease. And I know that this is the C.D. Howe Institute, and I know this is the National Club, but in a good old-fashioned Canadian, let's have some fun tonight. Janet and I have a little presentation that we'd like to make in honor of Dwight and Joe tonight.
It's a consolation prize.
If you can't win in the debate, you can win with gadgets. Thank you.
And that's Eeyore. It's not we're not saying anything about them in terms of...
No, not really.
Well, Made in China. Yeah. If we're going to allow props in the debate, they could at least be domestically manufactured props. So Eeyore gets the final word then, Brad, and we'll go
over to Dwight.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thanks to the C.D. Howe Institute and everyone for being here tonight. This has been, first of all, personally, I had to catch up on things. I've been out actually trying to make an honest living for the last few years. First of all, and thank you, Janet and Brad, for your optimism. I'm an optimistic Canadian, too, and there are umpteen great stories out there that we can talk about. Sadly, though, however, when it comes to growth and innovative companies, we're 25th in the world. When it comes to embracing disruptive ideas, we're 28th in the world. We can't ignore that. Competitiveness and taxation regulation, the judges asked us about that. I didn't quite address the other side. So there are absolute benefits to our healthcare system. I mean, these numbers are a little bit old. Maybe a former economic development minister can brush me up on them. It wasn't that long ago when healthcare costs in the United States contributed more to the price of a vehicle than steel does. Here in Canada, that's not the case. But you have to find that balance. And you can't look at where we're at today without looking at the risks that are sitting in front of us. Small business, I want to go a little bit more on that. I didn't really speak to the specifics of the question. We still have, in some provinces, special taxes on small business over and above the standard rates for business. That's the kind of thing, and there's lots of reasons for that, but that's the kind of thing that, in my view, hurts us in the long run. We talked about talent attraction, and we do a great job at that. And frankly, Mr. Trump and his like are helping us with that. And we need to continue to do that. But again, we have to take what I call a positive view of the future and not accept 12th in the world. Now I'll get back to what I wrote down. Joe and I have demonstrated that an existential crisis exists in Canada's competitiveness in the following ways. First, nada of the credible international authorities in the field of competitiveness place Canada even in the top 10 globally. And this has persisted for years across governments of every political stripe at the federal and the provincial levels. Canada's overall score, as I said, and we've demonstrated, belies even more serious problems below. Global competitiveness is dynamic. Technological change, coupled with the fact that many of our global competitors are not sitting still, brings added urgency to our need to do much better. And again, we've talked a lot about this tonight. I hear Joe's frustration. There are many institutional, political, and constitutional impediments to improving our situation, which means it takes more time here than it does in a lot of other jurisdictions. And I would like to quote an entrepreneur, a Canadian entrepreneur, gentleman some of you may know, Anthony Lasavera, the founder of Wind Mobile, who said earlier this year when asked, "When we play hockey, we expect to win, and we are disappointed if we don't win. I don't understand why we don't bring that same mentality to our business culture." Remember, it's all about a better quality of life for us, for our children, and our grandchildren. This is a great country. Let's not settle for 12th. Let's head for number 1. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear. Well, that was terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the point where you are going to be asked again for your views. At the beginning, among the audience, we had 70% Eeyores, 16% we need a stuffed Pollyanna or something, do we, on the other side of it? Sunny ways. 14% unsure. And among the jury, 75% Eeyore, 25% Pollyanna, 0% unsure. And it's now time to see how the eloquence, the persuasiveness, the logic, and the humor of our debaters may have changed people's views. Let me say, while you're thinking about it and while we're waiting for the technology to operate, that our debaters were a little reluctant, some of them, to sign up for this. They are busy people, and they have already given their careers very largely to public service. We were relentless in pursuit of them, however. And I do want to acknowledge that as they allowed themselves to be persuaded, I know some of them were thinking, this might be a lot of work, and it was. Our debaters put a lot of preparation into this. I think it shows, and we're going to give them another round of applause later, but I think right now we should acknowledge how much went into that. They cited a lot of interesting facts, some even from the C.D. Howe Institute, and put their arguments with a lot of force and imagination and some humor as well. I will look over towards the talliers. They're not giving me the thumbs up yet. But perhaps while they're working on that, I can also say thank you again to the jury. We really appreciate your being here. In a couple of cases, at least, it involved some travel. And Nathan, clearly you're a glutton for punishment, if this is punishment, or else an endorsement of the whole process. But Claire, Aaron, Peter, Marcel, Heather, Tiff, and Greg, we really appreciate you being here to do this. And I will also, nope, we got thumbs up, all right. So drum roll, figuratively speaking, how are we doing on the way out? Well, I think that we I'd like to propose that we applaud the affirmative side for having maintained their lead as effectively as they did, but I do note, it wasn't until I said Brad and Janet that I realized, yeah, the Rocky Horror Picture Show just set a new record for a run at Stratford. That was not deliberate. You're a great team. Yeah, Dan. But you made some progress in the minds of our audience and in our jury. And so congratulations for that. And it's a rare policy discussion that doesn't leave more people unsure at the end than they were at the beginning, so that's a tribute as well. Let me now just make a couple of housekeeping comments because you're a captive audience. And I do want to remark that in the event material in front of you, along with much more fulsome accounts of the accomplishments of our debaters than it was appropriate to give at the podium, you'll see that there are a couple of items coming up. There is an inside access call on assessing Ontario works, which will be of interest, I know, to some in the room. On November 15th, we have a conference on open banking, and then profiled in the material is Maureen Jensen at our benefactors lecture, which I know will be interesting to many of you. And perhaps the headliner of all, I'd like to announce that we have another Regent debate on tap, and that will be on Tuesday, April the 16th, 2019, on the question, be it resolved that governments should regulate big tech and its growing market power to protect the public interest. There are sign-up forms on chairs prior to the debate. You can leave them at your table if you're interested, and I do hope that you will come to hear that discussion. And perhaps having mentioned the upcoming Regent debate, I'll ask you one more time to thank Aaron and Heather for their generosity in supporting this event. Thank you very much. My colleagues, Duncan Munn, aforementioned, Devon, Paulina, the team in events and communications and research that pitched in to help with this. Thank you all. I really appreciate what you're doing to make these events as good as they are. And one more time, Dwight, Joe, Janet, Brad, that was tremendous. We're in your debt for a great evening.
Thanks, Joe.
The reception continues. Enjoy. Thank you.
I think we're good.